Welcome to the Expanding on Consciousness podcast. I am Mark Serto. In the Season 3 primer, I spoke briefly about synchronicity and consciousness as being related. It's an idea that I hold dear, although I have little to offer about the mysterious force and why it works. The best I can offer is it seems to be a function of consciousness. I have suspicions on its origins, on how it works and why, but I think I should leave it to you to come to your own conclusions. If you're interested in hearing my brief views on the interconnectedness of things and how I came to that conclusion, you can refer to the Season 3 primer. Quickly, in my view, this story unfolding in the thread of the many conversations that we've had on this podcast so far is an actual manifestation of the interconnectedness of things. Although the word synchronicity is less than 100 years old now, the phenomenon has actually been recognized for millennia. Human beings have always noticed patterns emerging between their thoughts and the physical world around them. In the current era, from the scientific, spelled capital P-S-I, point of view, the phenomenon is an actual manifestation of thought or perhaps intention or prayer. Synchronicity from that standpoint is a means in which the outer world reflects our inner world in order to send us a message. Theoretically, that message is there to help us know that we're not separate from each other, the natural world around us, or the world of energy or spirit, as it's been called by the ancients. From the scientific, that's spelt with a S-C-I, point of view, especially in the world of Jungian psychology, the phenomenon is described as an outward manifestation of our subconscious or perhaps the collective consciousness or soul of the world, the anima mundi, as Carl Jung put it. Those who are of a spiritual mindset see synchronicity as being the universe's or perhaps God's response to our thoughts and prayers. I personally have my own thoughts about it, but there's no denying for me that synchronicity is an actual thing. I see it revealed in my life all the time, and I pay attention. I have for a very long time now. As we unpack more and more about the mystery of consciousness and the interlinking principles of thought and matter, I can't help but wonder about what our ancestors thought about it. My assumption is that most of them noticed the connection and related it to an intervention of sorts by a higher power, or perhaps connected it to some magical ritual that they performed during a religious practice. This idea, of course, still lives with us today. In this podcast, we try to give voice to everyone who's studying the mystery of consciousness from a very serious standpoint. Some are studying its origins, or whether or not consciousness exists outside of the body. The fields of consciousness are many. And we've heard from all sorts of experts in the various fields, and we have a long way to go in unraveling this mystery. Consciousness is a very big field for study. From our perspective, one cannot pursue the truth of human consciousness without exploring the religious impulse. That desire to know has been with human beings for a very long time, and although it has taken many forms, and in the current era is being disregarded by many in the consciousness sciences through a materialist mindset, the impulse to know cannot be ignored. But when it comes to things like anomalous experiences in consciousness, such as the near-death experience or the out-of-body experience or any other unexplained phenomenon, the impulse of the materialist is to file 86 the results of any data that has to do with such phenomenon. And that's why this podcast exists, to give voice to those who are serious clinicians who study such phenomenon and to those who have a mystical answer to these experiences. All of our guests are at the forefront of such endeavors, and they deserve to be heard. Personally, I have met many thousands of people in my journey of studying consciousness. Some of the more hardcore atheists or materialists are often stunned when they personally have such experiences for themselves and they honestly don't know how such experiences can fit into the beliefs that they've held about consciousness for so long. Such experiences tend to forge a deeper need for inquiry into the mystery that is consciousness within the person who has such experiences. As we all know, such experiences have birthed religions themselves. So, spirituality is obviously an important aspect in human consciousness. However that expression takes place, beyond the dogma, there is some truth which always emerges in such practices. In my experience, that truth often creates the miracle of synchronicity. It seems to me unavoidable. Once a person begins to peek down a rabbit hole of consciousness, something happens which in many cases changes not only the consciousness of the individual, the interior life, but also the physical life of the individual, meaning that they start to notice new patterns emerging, new people emerging, new situations emerging. This all happens somewhat mysteriously and without explanation in the life of the one who strives to know. The only connective tissue there is consciousness. In this two-part series with author and Professor Robert Temple, we're going to try to unravel a bit more about what the ancients knew and apply that knowledge to what has been discovered about a new form of consciousness. In this conversation, we're going to take a bit of a journey through time, deep time. We won't be able to cover all of it, of course. It's just a 2-hour conversation. But if you find his views interesting, and I know I did, you can always read his many books. He's a fascinating and learned man who has a well-blended view of ancient religious mysteries and a very good knowledge of quantum mechanics. I hope you enjoy it. The search for the origin of human civilization is an important facet in the conversation of consciousness because it helps us understand how our consciousness has evolved. The study of archaeology and ancient religion speaks to both the rise of civilization and our relationship to the cosmos. My guest today has been challenging the established view of human history and human spirituality for almost 5 decades. Professor Robert Temple is an independent scholar and the author of a dozen provocative books, commencing with his international bestseller called The Serious Mystery. His books have been translated into 44 foreign languages. He's also a visiting professor of history and philosophy at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He is also a member of the Egyptian Exploration Society and the chairman of the Ancient Egypt Foundation. In addition to doing diligent research, writing academic papers and books, Professor Temple has also written for the Sunday Times, The Guardian, Time Life, Nature, and New Scientist magazine. His latest book, entitled The New Science of Heaven, reveals how over 99% of the universe is made of plasma, and how plasma exhibits sentience. That indicates that it may be alive and part of a larger consciousness system. Professor Temple, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's a great pleasure for me to meet you.
Pleasure's mine, sir. Like others today, your work has been controversial in the world of academic archaeology, especially with regards to Egyptian history, due to the fact that you hold that the human history is much older than archaeologists would like us to believe. So my first question to you is, how did you get started in this field as an academic, and what motivated you to look beyond the standard ideas of human history?
Well, I've always been an ornery character. Uh, I've always questioned everything. I've never really accepted what I was told.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been an arch skeptic of conventional thinking, even as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And I got into the world of books on my own. I taught myself to read and write, which is why people still criticize me about the way I hold my pen.
Really?
Because I held it in the same way that I held my crayons that I was using in my coloring books. And I haven't changed because I taught myself all this, you see. And so I'm not somebody who believes in standard education at all. I remember going to the first grade and thinking, this is a load of nonsense. I didn't learn a single thing. And all I did was learn the name of the prettiest girl in the class was Rita.
That's valuable information, though.
Well, yeah, but she didn't have a phone number yet. She was too young.
Well, there you go.
And so then I skipped a couple of years. So I very quickly ended up being 2 years younger than everybody else, which was a strange experience, really, because I was, I went to boarding school when I was 12, and they called me the midget because I was a foot shorter than everybody else, and I was 2 years younger. I mean, I was 12. The youngest person in the school apart from me was 14. This is a boys' school. And so I was the midget. Of course, I did eventually cease to be a midget. I became relatively normal size. But when I was younger, the jealous boys who were all so much bigger than me used to hurl an insult at me and call me brains. Brains was meant to be an insult. Oh, there's brains.
Right.
You know, I mean, can you imagine brains being an insult? But that's how they conceived of it. And
yeah, that's just kid stuff, and I'm glad that you didn't allow it to get too deeply under your skin. Let's talk about how you got involved in Egyptology. The concepts that you put forth in your books regarding the tetrahedron designs of the pyramids that exist not only in Egypt, but also in Chichen Itza. You present a very different model and idea as to why the pyramids were developed, what they were for, and why the designs exist as they do. And it's very different from the conventional ideas. Let's give the audience at least a little clue as to why your ideas are different from the standard model of Egyptology and archaeology, and what it is that you're trying to present to the general and academic public.
well, of course, that's that's a very big subject, and to describe it fully would take a very long time. But I have done work in archaeometry as part of a small team,
right,
under the auspices of the Ministry of Antiquities, and with official permission, went with a Greek professor colleague who had developed a new dating technique, and we went to numerous sites. My wife was a part of this team as well. She made all the logistical arrangements. We went around dating many things. Now, in terms of specific dates, the last king of the second dynasty, which is the end of what's called the Archaic period of Egypt, the Old Kingdom officially begins with the third dynasty. This is just the new modern chronology. Okay. This isn't what the ancient Egyptians thought.
Right.
The last king was called Khosy, and so his tomb had been found at Abydos, or Abydos, both pronunciations are correct, and excavated by Petrie long ago. But Gunther Dreyer, who was the head of the German Institute in Cairo at the time of which I speak, he's now retired. He may even have died. He wanted to re-excavate this tomb because he thought he'd find some more seals, which indeed he did, plenty of them. Because his research, his digging techniques were more thorough than those of Petrie 100 years earlier. And so he invited us to go, because the tomb was only uncovered for 2 weeks. Then he got his seals and photographed it and everything, and then covered the whole thing up in sand again, so that it will never be exposed again, I'm sure, by anyone ever. So we had the unique experience of visiting this tomb. And what we did was we were able to get dates on it from using 3 different dating techniques and then matching them together to come up with something that fit all 3. So it was an infallible date.
Right.
There was a surrounding of where his sarcophagus had once been, which was made of limestone blocks. So without going into the details of the dating itself, we came up at the end with a date that was precisely 279 years too early for the contemporary chronology.
Right.
Well, Dreyer didn't like the results, so he didn't even include that in his report. I mean, he grumbled.
Right.
He realized that it's probably true, but he wasn't going to waste his time trying to discuss it and what does it mean and is it true. And he just ignored it. But he was a nice bloke. Rather Dreyer was rather dry.
And was he though?
Yeah, I like him. There's nothing that wasn't likable about him. It's just that he was rather a dry, scholarly chap.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one bit of dating we did that was very, very, very precise, only because it was 3 different dating techniques coming together. And so that already throws the existing and conventional chronology out.
Right.
You see, the problem is that the next king was the first king of the 3rd dynasty,
mm-hmm.
and his name was Zoser.
Mm-hmm.
And it was his vizier, who basically ran the show for him, was the famous Imhotep. So Zoser's seals were found by Dreyer in the tomb of Kasikamui, which meant that they must have overlapped. This, because otherwise, how would the next king's seals be in there?
Right.
If there'd been a big interval between, and so this made all kinds of problems, which nobody really wants to have to face. You see, the limestone blocks that surrounded the sarcophagus spot in the tomb of this earlier king were so badly cut that it would look like it had been made by chimpanzees.
Okay.
That crude. I mean, I was so shocked. I couldn't believe my eyes.
Very much not in keeping with the usual artistic.
It's the technical things abilities that I was concerned about, because the next king, Imhotep built the step pyramid at Saqqara for him, mm-hmm. showing a great mastery of stonework. Well, what does this mean? That there was no gap between the two, chronologically speaking. They even overlapped.
Mm-hmm.
Zoser was alive at the time of Kasikamui, who couldn't, he had nobody who could cut any stones for him except a chimpanzee. And yet, Zoser had Imhotep who built the step pyramid, and this is just a few years later.
Right.
What does this mean? So I came up with a theory about that, which is in one of my books, that it must have meant that there was a very serious divide between North and South Egypt.
Right.
Because the tomb I speak of was in the south, what they call Upper Egypt.
Okay.
And of course, the Saqqara is in the north, which they call Lower Egypt. You have to look, upper and lower are reversed in terms of Egyptian archaeology, because you're looking down the Nile towards the Mediterranean.
Right.
So Upper Egypt is near the source of the Nile. It's the south. Okay. And you're towards the Mediterranean. And by the time it turns into a delta, that's Lower Egypt, you see.
Okay.
So I need to explain that to people, because upper and lower, in the way we think, would be turned around and be the opposite.
Right, right.
But you have to know that to understand the Egyptian stuff. So I thought that the only solution to this could be that only the people in the north had knowledge of stonework, and they weren't going to share it with the people in the south, keeping it to themselves. And I think that must have been true. I came across the same thing, strangely enough. I wrote a book called The Crystal Sun. This is jumping subjects slightly.
Right.
Which was about ancient optical technology. I found over 400 ancient magnifying lenses and so on in the basements of museums around the world, which had been classified as lentoids rather than lenses. In other words, they look like lenses, but since we know that lenses can't have existed, we call them lentoids.
Right.
Of course, they were perfectly functioning lenses. It's just that the archaeologists are so terrified of saying anything new.
Right.
Any of them, even one of them, to admit that even one of these 400 objects was an actual optical object, even though they obviously were, and I proved it, it would be heresy, you see. They wouldn't get the next grant, and they wouldn't get promoted, and they'd be ostracized by their colleagues. The usual thing.
Sure.
So this research took me up to Scandinavia. Sorry if I'm leaving Egypt for Scandinavia for a moment.
No worries.
I went and did a lot of research on the amazing Viking lenses, which are carved out of rock crystal, all of them. And they had a fantastic technology for manufacturing lenses in amongst the Swedish Vikings.
Mm-hmm.
But the Swedish Vikings kept the technology to themselves. They were the Eastern Vikings, and they would not let the Western Vikings of what we today call Norway know anything about it. And they based a lot of their manufacture on the island of Gotland, which is to the east of Sweden, which could be protected by the Viking ships, you see, so nobody could get there. And I published a special study on the Gotland lenses, which are in the Gotland Museum, and they were so thrilled they translated that into Swedish and published it in their Swedish Archaeological Journal, because I was the only person who'd ever studied the Gotland lenses. But the point of my mentioning this is that you have two contemporary civilizations who are related to one another, just as the Egyptians were related to one another. You've got the Eastern Vikings and the Western Vikings. The Eastern Vikings have a highly advanced technology which the Western Vikings lack completely. So it's very similar. It's analogous. So that's my point. I don't bother to try to discuss this with Egyptologists because they're very much in their patterned ways of thinking. And they would just say, oh, well, it's not my business. That's not my specialty. I've put this in one of my books that hasn't been published in the United States called Egyptian Dawn.
Mm-hmm.
It was published only in the UK. I highly recommend that book. You can buy some copies on the internet, because that book was devoted to try to discover the origins of Egyptian civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Brings us back to the megaliths that you were wondering about.
Right.
So as a child, when I was 9, 10 years old, I developed a craze for Atlantis, and I was reading all those books by Ignatius Donnelly and all those kind of people. There were a lot of them because, people in the 1890s were very, very keen on Atlantis and writing all those books about Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I first started to learn about Plato and that kind of thing. So I always had in the back of my mind, having left all that behind as being a bit unscholarly as I moved along with my education, I didn't discredit a lot of it. I always thought that they had somehow got the wrong answer out of it. So in Egyptian Dawn, I come up with a completely new answer to the riddle of Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
It would take a while to explain it fully, and I won't. But basically, we know that the megalithic culture was earlier than the conventional date of the pyramids, at least. And so I wondered whether the megalithic peoples, whoever they were, we don't know who they were,
right,
might have fed into Egypt somehow. So then I had to do a lot of research into the megaliths, and I discovered, and I've been to the world's largest megalithic ring. My wife and I went there many years ago. It's in Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Mazora, and there's no road. You can't get there except by walking across fields, and you have to know where to go. You can easily lose your way. You ask a local where are the stones, and they'll point you in the opposite direction because they don't want tourists.
Mm.
And almost nobody's ever been there.
Right.
And but I did go there, and I photographed it, and some of those pictures are in the book. And so I realized that the megalithic civilization that we think of as being so heavily present in Britain and Ireland,
mm-hmm.
that was an extension. I later discovered that the center of the megalithic civilization was in the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
You have intact megalithic monuments in Spain where they have 200-ton stones in the ceiling. How did they do that?
Right.
Now, I immediately connected this in my mind with the 200-ton stones which are on the floor of the Giza Peninsula in front of the pyramids. Right. I thought, well, those are stones of exactly the same size that they were managing to lift and work with in Spain.
Right.
It looks to me as if somehow working in stone and the expertise connected with it made its way to Egypt. Had to. to explain a lot that was happening. This made sense. So I began to trace what was really happening with the megalithic remains of northern Africa, because it's well known that they go down the coast of Morocco. And not just the ring I'm talking about, which is inland. There was a great city, which was then taken over by the Carthaginians later, called Lixus, which was a megalithic site. It was a settlement. So then I knew Alexander Thom, the man who had done the surveys of all the British megalithic sites. And he had been up to Sweden and discovered that the megalithic peoples had been building rings and monuments as far north as Sweden, using the same geometrical principles based on Pythagorean triangles of different types that were used in Britain. So it became clear to me, because Thom was thinking like this, although he didn't know anything about the Northern African ones. And then he died, you see. So I couldn't keep talking with him about this. That the megalithic civilization was a coastal civilization facing the Atlantic Ocean. And it was an Atlantic civilization, but it was a coastal one. And they were sailing up and down a stretch of 2,000 miles. And that they even went as far as Nigeria because they seem to have influenced the Yoruba tribe. There are books about that. And so at least as far as halfway down the African coast and all the way up to Sweden. This was Atlantis. Now, you have this problem of what was this all about and how did nobody know the truth? It's because the Mediterranean civilizations, whenever they tried to sail through the Pillars of Hercules, be ambushed by ships lying in wait for them, so that nobody could get out. But just in case anybody could get through, and once in a while they could, they created a cover story and spread it all around the Mediterranean as a kind of urban legend that said that if you sailed straight out into the Atlantic Ocean, you would find a great island, the island of Atlantis. Of course, that was untrue. It was a phony story created to get anybody who broke through the blockade to sail straight out into the ocean, from which they would never.
So Atlantis was a booby-trap lore.
Yes. If the ships turned right or left instead, they would discover the megalithic cities and settlements.
Right.
And also the precious route to Cornwall to get the tin. You see, what the megalithic peoples were able to do, and this was inherited later by the Phoenicians, who were 1,000 years later, it was the only way to make bronze, to have superior weapons, is to have tin to mix with your copper. Otherwise, you can't have bronze. And so basically, the Phoenicians were arms dealers. They were going to the tin mines of Cornwall, the only ones accessible, shiploads of tin, taking it to various island bases, like the one off the coast of Naples, for instance, the island Ischia, one of their metallurgical centers. And they would take the tin there and to other places, like including Cyprus. And they had plenty of copper, and they would manufacture bronze swords and spearheads and all that everybody needed to kill each other. And they would sell the arms to everybody around the whole Mediterranean and get super rich. So they were arms dealers, the Phoenicians. This was their racket. And so they couldn't let anybody else find out where the tin was because they'd lose their monopoly.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that was pretty much a state secret.
Oh, yeah, and if you told anybody, you were dead.
Right. Well, let's get back to the technology of the ancients and the megalithic structures. It's long been believed by mainstream archaeology that the megaliths are essentially astrological instruments. They were also an attempt, at least in some thoughts, to harmonize the cosmos with the earthly plane, as above, so below sort of cosmology. Perhaps a means of harnessing that power, like the obelisk in Egypt. In your book, The Serious Mystery, you make the case that this ancient desire for connection to the cosmos is actually a bit deeper. You speak a bit about the connection of the West African Dogon people and the sense of allegiance or harmony that they had with the Sirius star system as being a place of origin. Tell the audience a little bit about this mystery and what the implications are regarding the building of megalithic structures and the technologies that would be required to be able to create such a structure, and why was it important to them?
Well, there's another factor comes in here before I go into all that serious mystery business. I believe that the pyramids are not made of cut stone, but cast stone.
Mm-hmm.
You see, I'm friendly with a man called Joseph Davidovitz, who's a chemistry professor in France, who invented a new kind of cement. He's probably the world's leading expert on ancient Roman cement. And his new cement doesn't have any limestone in it, but he also has perfected a technique of making large limestone blocks similar to those in the pyramid by casting them using limestone, of course. Mm-hmm. And so the reason why you get fossils and things in those stones, but mostly settling down towards the bottom, is because they were cast as a kind of sludge in wooden frames, and then the frames were taken away, and then you put
right.
And the reason why you can't fit a razor blade between some of them is because they were cast directly on top of one another.
Sure. Like you would today, modern day cement blocks, if you were casting them out of plywood and support structure.
That's right. And so he maintains that they didn't have to have this fantasy of 20,000, 30,000 men with ramps and all of that to build the pyramids, because they weren't carrying blocks
right.
up pyramids. They were casting them. So what they were doing is they were taking limestone rubble from the quarries
mm-hmm.
and crushing it and mixing it with whatever. I won't go into all those chemical details. It really would get into a complicated discussion. And that he's managed to replicate the ancient Egyptian technique of casting pyramid blocks. And I have personally seen at his place in France a 3-ton block and a 4-ton block, which he and his sons working together cast
mm-hmm.
according to this recipe. And they were perfectly good limestone blocks, just like you'd see in the pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
So it works. He's proved it. And I believe that this is the solution to the riddle of the construction of the pyramids. It doesn't apply necessarily to the ones which are down on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But the pyramids themselves, and this only applies to the limestone parts because the granite sections are quite a separate issue, they would have been cast. So you only have to have guys carrying bags or skins full of the rubble and the other things that you're going to mix.
Minerals and waters and whatever else is needed, right?
Of course, the water. And then pour it into the mold, mix it up, and then you stomp on it, it goes slowly hard. And it takes about 3 days in the Egyptian heat,
right,
for such a sludgy mess to turn into a hard, solid limestone cast block.
Right.
And so this would enable the pyramids to be constructed in a way that makes some kind of physical sense.
Right.
Now, I don't mean to underestimate the technological genius involved, because what's more interesting than the construction, because I think that's been resolved as a relatively simple side of things, it's the plans of the pyramids and the Giza plateau, which are almost superhuman to imagine. Now, in my book that I mentioned a moment ago called Egyptian Dawn, the first chapter is devoted to explaining the plan of the Giza plateau.
Mm.
Now, if you know anything about cryptography and secrets and all that, it's conventional to have 3 layers to a really important secret. So I discovered that there were 3 different layers to the mystery of the Giza plateau, which are all geometrical. And I was able to crack all 3 of them. The idea of having 3 is that maybe somebody can crack 1, but they're never going to crack 3. But
right.
I cracked all 3, and I tested it out using Adobe Illustrator, using Egyptian Air Force maps taken from above.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to demonstrate that all the angles and measurements and everything that were in these 3 complicated overlaying plans were accurate to within 1 foot.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you could get it down to 1 inch using satellites, but I don't have a satellite. So I thought the Egyptian Air Force maps are good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, the fantastic, almost inhuman genius of this, it has to be appreciated when you realize that the plan was a flat plan laid out in perfection upon a hill that was sloping.
Okay.
And so I was able to get the flat plan perfect, as if you're looking down from above. And I even discovered that there was an eye of Ra
Mm-hmm.
that could only be seen from the sky. In other words, they had the eye of Ra looking up at the sun in this plan.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that I can describe in words. You have to see the pictures. There is a website for the dedicated to that book, and also to my other Egyptian book, which I did with my wife Olivia, called The Sphinx Mystery, which talks about me going inside the Sphinx and where there's a tunnel inside the Sphinx, and I photographed it and so on. Everything you ever wanted to know about the Sphinx is in there, because we translated and published everything ever published about the Sphinx from the time of Pliny in the Roman Empire
Mm-hmm.
up until 1837, whatever language it was in. We've got the back of the book. There's this huge appendix, which contains everything ever written. I translated the German, Olivia translated the French. The one Dutch thing I got a Dutch friend to do. And so it's all there. You don't have to go to the British Library or the Library of Congress, then they wouldn't have everything there anyway.
Right.
Everything's there. It took years to gather it together to get it into one single book. So if you get the book that's still on Amazon called The Sphinx Mystery, that's the book that has everything that was ever published about the Sphinx basically for 2,000 years in it. You don't have to go to a library. It's all there for you. I did all the work for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of the book is describing all these very strange things about the Sphinx.
And I want to get into all of those interesting things about the Sphinx as soon as we come back from our quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about the tunnel. Stay tuned.
Expanding on Consciousness is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a nonprofit organization and leader in consciousness education and research, teaching you how to actively explore and use expanded states of consciousness, providing direct experiences that are deeply personal, uniquely meaningful, and life-changing. Monroe has been helping people create more meaningful and joyful lives through the guided exploration of expanded consciousness for 50 years. Gain the knowledge and understanding you seek to create the life you desire. Learn more about where to start your journey to expanded awareness with Monroe. Visit monroeinstitute.org or check out our Expand Meditation app, available on the App Store or Google Play.
So a lot of people don't know that there's a tunnel underneath the Sphinx and something happened to it. Tell us what happened to the tunnel beneath the Sphinx.
So what happened to the tunnel inside the Sphinx? Because what happened was in, I think it was 1926, a French chap was hired by the Egyptian government, which was a monarchy at that time, to tidy up the Sphinx for tourist purposes, because more and more people were coming for tourism.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically poured concrete down you see, I forgot to mention that there is a chamber under the Sphinx, but it's not the same date as the Sphinx. It was intruded, as the archaeologists call it, probably during the 26th dynasty, the Sai period.
Mm-hmm.
And it was used as a tomb. Because we know that because it had hieroglyphs on the walls, so it can't be Old Kingdom.
Okay.
And so I collected eyewitness reports published of people who had been into and had seen the chamber under the Sphinx with their own eyes,
Right.
for a period of 350 years.
Okay.
It's all in there, and the German bits are translated and the French bits are translated. All the eyewitness reports proving conclusively that until it was blocked in 1926 by this oafish Frenchman with concrete,
Uh-huh.
there was this chamber beneath the Sphinx. From the waist, they intruded a shaft down, and so connected with that, there was this tunnel that went from the rear. Because to get into the Sphinx, I went into its bum. There's a wonderful photo that Olivia took of me with she called Robert with his head sticking out of the Sphinx's ass.
Yes.
Which is what it looks like. So that's how you get in. And it's well known that there is a sort of chamber, something carved out of the rock that's a bit of a loophole. But what nobody ever mentions, and certain archaeologists don't want to know, is that there is definitely a tunnel that went along inside the Sphinx's body. Because when you go in the bottom of the Sphinx, you look up and to the right, there's a tunnel going along. And it went along the right hip. And the part that goes almost as far as the waist still exists. And then the rest of it was filled in with concrete, and you can't get past any further. And I'm sure it went all the way to the head, because this is at a later date. Well, they were having a voice come out of the Sphinx, and the priest would go along this tunnel to speak from the Sphinx's head, as it was treated as an oracle, you see.
Really? I was about to make the comparison between that and the Temple of Delphi.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes, there's that kind of thing going on. We're talking about later times, not the original. Right. And so in the Ptolemaic times, it was a well-known oracle site. People would go to the Sphinx.
Okay.
Where the Greeks would go to Delphi.
Right.
And this was being used as a secret passage for the priest to crawl his way up to the front and speak from the Sphinx's face. Mm-hmm. And people thought the Sphinx was magic and was really... And so I couldn't go all the way along that tunnel because it's very, very dangerous. It was rather inadequately propped up with wooden struts to stop it collapsing. And so I decided that I didn't feel like sacrificing my life for archaeology. So I didn't try to get up there. I could have done, but I would have had to move all the struts, and I could have been crushed. And what's the point of that? Who would ever know? Right. So I took the more conservative position, and I extricated myself. But I did photograph the beginning of it, and I did prove that there is this tunnel that goes along inside the Sphinx, which nobody has ever mentioned before. I don't know why. Of course, I don't think that any Egyptologist has ever seen it. Uh-huh. A few of the Egyptians. And you see, Zahi Hawass, whom I've met many times, he couldn't squeeze in there. He's too fat. And because to get into the bottom of the Sphinx, you can't squeeze through if you're fat. Mm-hmm. He's probably stuck his head in, and that's about it. But there's no way he could get in there. Right. Because he wouldn't fit. And what they often did, with these oracle tricks that the Greeks also had, and this was happening all over the ancient world, is they would have entries to things that were so small that only a child, they'd get a boy of about 10 to go into some of these things that no adult could get into, which also protected the secret, you see.
Sure.
So this is also in my book, The Sphinx Mystery, and many, many, many other things about the Sphinx, such as I've been able to identify the face, prove whose face that is. There's no use trying to talk to Zahi about this because I can't remember whether he thinks it's Cheops or Khephren, but he had an argument in the year 2000 when the International Egyptological Conference was held in Cairo that year, with the guy who was at that time the head of the German Institute. One of them thought the face was Khephren and the other thought it was Cheops. I think Zahi thought it was Cheops and the German guy thought it was Khephren. But it obviously doesn't look anything like Khephren. And there is only the one tiny survival of the little ivory miniature of Cheops, so you can't say anything about that. But I was able to work out what was going on with the Sphinx, that it was originally a statue of a crouching Anubis, who was the guardian dog, guarding the sacred necropolis. Makes sense?
Right.
That because everybody who's visited the Sphinx, the first thing they say is, the head's so small and the body's like an ocean liner with this little bubble on it for a head. like a hazelnut. And so it's obvious, and it has been obvious to many people, that the head was recarved out of the neck of a previous head, which was much larger and according to proportions. Because can you imagine the ancient Egyptians who were fanatical about proportion in architecture and statuary, putting a tiny head on a huge statue? They would never do that because proportion was sacred.
Right, right.
So it had to be a big head. So I've suggested that the head was really a dog's head, because people say that that's a lion. The body is a lion, but it's not. And I show pictures of crouching dogs, and they're the same as the Sphinx. It has no big rising shoulders and chest and like a lion. It's completely unlike a lion's body. And so it was a dog's body, and it had a dog's head, and it was simply a statue of Anubis, a giant statue of Anubis, the guardian. And what happened was, at the end of the Old Kingdom, the Egyptian kingdom collapsed. This is well known to archaeologists. And there were riots at Giza. And this is when the people were furious at the end of the Sixth Dynasty, and they rampaged all over Giza, smashing everything they could, including all the statues that were in the temples that had the statues in. Well, we still see the statue bases today, but there's no statues. But they did find one that the priests had thrust down a well, which is now in the museum, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, which is one of the most beautiful statues in the history of the world. It's just incredibly famous statue of Khephren. And but all the others, and then we know that there were many, were all smashed by the angry crowd. Well, they would have done the easy thing to the Sphinx. They would have knocked off the nose and the ears.
Right.
Well, there you are with a mutilated Sphinx.
Right.
And so the Middle Kingdom comes along 150 years later, after things have calmed down, and reestablishes the pharaoh office and the sacred kingdom concept in the Middle Kingdom. And it doesn't quite fit their agenda to have a mutilated Sphinx with a smashed face, no nose and no ears,
right,
sitting there guarding the sacred necropolis and the pyramids. It's not good for PR.
Right.
Bad for the brand. So they have to do something about it. It was clear that they had to put some kind of face on this statue. And so there was a particular pharaoh, and I've identified him precisely. When this came up, the priests would have gone to him and said, "You're a pharaohship. Whose face do you think that we should put on?"
But of course, the answer is self-evident, right?
Yeah. Well, he said, I was rather fancying the idea of my face.
I need a presidential library.
Exactly.
Right.
So I was able to identify him as the pharaoh Amenemhet II. And there is a very good surviving face of him in the Louvre.
Uh-huh.
And I photographed that when I went to Paris. I went to the Louvre and I photographed his face there. And I photographed the face on what remains of the face on the Sphinx. And if you allow for the fact the nose has been knocked off by a fanatical cleric, Islamic cleric, long ago, because it was heathen, you see. Mm-hmm. The faces are the same, absolutely the same. Mm-hmm. And there was a German archaeologist in the 1890s who published a paper because at that time the Sphinx was still covered up to its neck in sand. Right. He was able to stand high enough in that sand that he could study the headdress of the Sphinx. And he made a study of the headdresses of every dynasty. He surveyed all the statues in all the museums, different parts of the world, and he created a kind of chronology of headdress design from all the surviving evidence, of which there's a great deal.
So they had changed over the years then?
Oh, yes, and you can pretty much date a headdress.
Okay.
And he proved, it's absolutely conclusive, that the face had to be from the Middle Kingdom. Uh-huh. Because that was the only time when the headdress looked like that.
Right.
And so he got it a bit wrong because he thought it was Amenemhet III. But in fact, I've been able to show that it was the earlier Amenemhet II who really did this. So I was able to prove this guy correct. He had been ridiculed for over 100 years by all the archaeologists say, what did he know? I mean, the idea that the face could be milking and it's nonsense. But he proved it by the headdress, and I was able to substantiate that proof with the photographs of the faces. So in the Sphinx Mystery, my book on that of that title, I have all the evidence to prove whose face is really on the Sphinx. So everybody who's interested in the Sphinx has got to buy the Sphinx Mystery, which is not expensive. It's on Amazon.com.
Right.
And everything's there. You know, as Woody Allen would say, everything you ever wanted to know about the Sphinx and never dared to ask.
Right. Let's bring the theme of consciousness back into this conversation. There are a lot of academics who believe that the Egyptians are the primary source of most of the spiritual traditions that emerged from the East, that its esoteric wisdom had an influence on Judaism, it had an influence on Christianity, etc. And simultaneously, there's a lot of people who believe that the ancient Egyptians and other civilizations who built these megalithic structures were in touch with extraterrestrial civilizations who actually helped them build that structures, or perhaps there was a technology behind the structure itself. That would include the Dogon people, have that sort of belief, right? So what are your thoughts about all of that? Where do you stand on that? And that's a lot to take in. That's a big question, I know.
Well, I'd have to have 100 feet to stand on all of that at once.
Right.
Maybe I should clarify about the Dogon tribe of Mali before we go further. Way back when I was an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia before I moved permanently to England. I knew a man who was a kind of mentor of mine, from whom I learned quite a bit about science, because I wasn't studying science at university. I was doing Oriental studies and Sanskrit and that kind of thing. And I went to see him one day because he lived in Center City, Philadelphia. And I turned up and he was sitting reading a book, and I said, "What's the book, Arthur?" Because his name was Arthur Young. He's the guy who invented the Bell helicopter. And he said, "Oh, it's a very interesting book. It's a book edited by somebody called Darrell Ford with an E on the end, and called African Worlds. And it's got a whole collection of different chapters, and each chapter is about a different African tribe. And some of the tribes are more interesting than others, as you would expect." He said, "The most amazing thing about this book is that the chapter I've just finished reading by some French anthropologists about a tribe called the Dogon." He didn't know how to say Dogon because nobody had ever heard of the Dogon in the English-speaking world, because it was in a former French territory of French Equatorial Africa. It had been a colony. And he said, these are a very strange people, these Dogons. And he said that their religion and culture is not like any other that I've ever come across. And he was always reading about ancient cultures and tribal cultures, because it's based on the star Sirius. And he said, well, he knew that the Egyptians set their calendar by Sirius rising. That's very well known. It has been for a long time. He said, of course, what I've just told you is not strictly speaking true, because it isn't really the star Sirius itself that everything's based on in their culture. They say that there's a second star there.
And for clarity, let's tell the audience that that was unknown for quite some time, even by contemporary astronomers.
Well, The star is called Sirius B, and it's a very small white dwarf which goes around Sirius.
Right.
It was discovered in the 19th century. Now the Dogon, and it has an orbital period of about 50 years. Now the Dogon based their culture on that star. Now you can't see it with the naked eye, and it's very difficult to see it with an optical telescope because you're blinded by the light of the big star.
Right.
And so I went and saw a nice chap later on in Washington called Irving Lindenblad, an optical astronomer who was at the U.S. Naval Observatory, which is directly opposite the strange house that the American vice president lives in. Most people don't ever see. It's an odd setup, really. Anyway, Irving Lindenblad was an incredibly nice man, and he had taken the first really good photo of Sirius B. Oh, he worked and worked and worked at that. He had to use all kind of technical tricks to get that to work out. I won't go into them. And I reproduced this book in this picture in my book that I later published called The Sirius Mystery, because it was this wonderful portrait photo of the mysterious star. And so going back to Arthur Young and what he said that it seems to me that there is another star at the Sirius system, isn't there? And I happen to know that there was because I had to do an introductory course in astronomy. And not that long before, my professor, who had some Norwegian name actually, had been talking about the binary star system of Sirius. So I knew that there was another one. Well, that's true, Arthur. You're right. It just so happens I've just been studying that at Penn in my rather basic introductory astronomy course, that there's this double star system. They call it a binary system. And there is this little star that goes around it. I know that's true. And I've even seen it in the textbook that we've been using, the picture of the orbit. And I went back and checked in the book, and indeed the orbit was 50 years. And I then went to see Arthur again. I couldn't phone him because we didn't have mobile phones back then.
Right.
And I was living in a dormitory, you see. And I said, Arthur, the orbital period is 50 years, according to this tribe. Admit that they cannot see, that no one can see the star that is the center of their culture and religion. They know its orbital period. They know the orbital period of an invisible star, which they admit is invisible. How? He said, well, I don't know. How? He answered my question with the same question. How would they know this? And so I tucked that away in the back of my mind because I was busy with university things.
Sure.
What they said to the French anthropologists, you see, the French anthropologists wrote all this serious tradition up in an article that appeared in a French anthropological journal, which nobody bothered to read except for 6 people, which is usual. There are 4 tribes in Mali that are related to each other as cousins, you might say. The Dogon, the Bambara, the Bozo, who are the fishermen who live on the riverside, and the Minyanka, of whom I know relatively little. The Bambara are fascinating as well, and they all share the Sirius tradition. And they are related also to the tribe in Ghana called the Akan, A-K-A-N. So I got to know the anthropologist who had studied the migration routes. Now these were all one group of people at one time. They've now been split into 5. And they came down from the oasis of the Fezzan in the Sahara Desert.
Okay.
So the Dogon, they do claim that this information was given to them by visitors from a planet in the system of the star Sirius. They say this.
Right.
But they say the visit did not occur in Africa. This is key. I've often been accused by people who don't know what they're talking about, that want to criticize me just for the sake of it, as claiming that spacemen had landed in Africa. That's absolutely not true. The Dogon have never maintained that. They insist that the visitation of these beings from the other world took place in very, very, very remote antiquity in the Northeast, beyond where their ancestors came from. And so I was able to work out, with the other the English anthropologists' help, the identity of the people from North Africa who came down from the oasis, and they had come originally from the oasis of Siwa, which is on the border of Egypt and modern day Libya.
Uh-huh.
And the chief god there is Amun.
Right.
And guess what the name of the chief god of the Dogon tribe is? Amma.
There you go.
And so, and I even have in my possession a Bambara carving that's about 300 years old of Anubis. It's an Anubis head on a sort of sacred object that they used in some ceremony. And I bought it in Paris, where you can buy these anthropological artifacts from these tribes, because they were visited by the French all the time. Very few English speakers ever went there.
Right.
There's no doubt whatsoever in my mind that they came originally from Egypt, and that they were, for some reason which we'll never know, they left Egypt, and they were Amun worshippers, just like the priests of Thebes were, because Amun was the god of Thebes in the south of Egypt. And for some reason they went out and became a wandering tribe in North Africa, in what the ancients called Libya, because Libya was the name that the Greeks and Romans gave to everything from the borders of Egypt all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. That was all called Libya.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are your thoughts about the ancient astronaut theory? Want to know the answer to that? You're going to have to tune in next week. Perfect cliffhanger, don't you think? See you next week.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2023, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.